Hello, I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. This series of podcasts is aimed at financial planning professionals and also those who are looking to enter the financial planning profession. We will be talking during the podcast about all things certified financial planner certification related, talking to other CFPs around the world, and also we will be dropping in on some new entrants who've just entered the financial planning profession, and we'll be checking up along the way on a regular basis with them to see how they're getting on. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. And this is our second episode of Talk to the Experts about gaining your CFP assessment pass and becoming a CFP professional in the UK. And once again, I'm joined by Chris Wicks, who is also a trainer with Lockie Consultants. Hello, Chris.
Hi there.
In today's session, we are going to talk about calculations, death by calculations, death by spreadsheets, and everything to do with how you might struggle and tips and hints around all of that, aren't we?
Exactly. And I think the first question that often arises is, can you use software such as Voyant, Truth and CashCal when you prepare your case study?
Yeah, good question. I'm asked that quite a lot. So the answer is, well, potentially you could, but the reality is that I don't know anybody, or in fact, I know one person who has passed using one of those pieces of software. The reason for that is several-fold, actually. Firstly, that Voyant, Truth, CashCalc, and similar proprietary software out there has never been designed or assessed against the international financial planning criteria for CFP globally. They're designed for a completely different reason, to be used in front of clients and, to be very visual so clients can see, broadly where they're going to be based on the assumptions that you make. So you might get to similar answers, but the assessment criteria requires you to individually show how each and every objective that the client has is going to be met. And that's where most people come unstuck. What tends to happen is that, if you take Voyant, for example, it puts all of the assets together, runs the lifelong cash flow as the others do too. But it's that ability to separate each part out to show how much it needs to be allocated for each of the different objectives that those pieces of software don't do. And that specific sets of criteria in the assessment process that need to be looked at by the assessors. So what tends to happen is that people go, no, I'm going to use my proprietary software, and they crack on and they use it, submit it, and they tend to fail fairly heavily because of that reason we've just discussed. And then what happens is they go, right, okay, well, that's basically my first submission out of the 3 submissions that I have. That's all out the window. So how do I fix this? And the way to fix it is to deconstruct some of the spreadsheets, or some of the proprietary software into spreadsheets. And that takes time and energy. And I know that a lot of you have listened to the podcast that I did with Alistair Walker. And he said that he wished that he'd never started with proprietary software because the amount of time it took was significantly more than the 200 hours all told to pass, because he started using Voyant, actually it was initially, and then realized that he had to ditch it because it was just so much work to use part Voyant, part spreadsheets. So it all turned into a bit of a nightmare.
I think there's another issue. By the way, this isn't a criticism of these pieces of software. They have a particular job to do,
yes,
and they're very good at it. But I think one of the issues with them, of course, is that they perhaps allow people to not necessarily engage in critical reasoning, because you think that if I plug the data into the piece of software, it's just going to crunch the numbers for me, and there I am, and I'll have everything all done for me nice and easy in about 15 minutes flat, not 150 to 200 hours, And unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. So, this is a good news, bad news story in a way. The bad news is really, it probably isn't going to work. As Jackie's pointed out, Jackie only knows of one person who's ever actually passed using it, and they were a trainer. So weigh that up against yourself and think whether or not you actually are going to pass, because there's no point entering for an assessment, paying a load of money out for it, and then setting yourself up to fail, really, is there?
No.
So the good news come bad news bit is there is a way of doing it, but it requires quite a bit of effort on your part, but it will then give you the outcome that you're looking for.
Yeah. And the other thing is, this assessment, the level 7 assessment, I mean, let's just talk in layman's terms, what the level 7 means. I mean, it is master's degree level. It's, dissertation, university, master's degree level kind of complexity we're talking about here. So when you think about that logically, using my critical thinking brain again, then you know that you can't just knock it out using one of those pieces of software in 15 minutes, because you're not going to get a master's degree level qualification based on, that little, few hours of work.
Exactly. So therefore, you basically have to go back to basics and build it yourself for this purpose, really. And to do that, you need to know what you're doing with Excel. And also be able to think carefully about how you're going to structure it and what information it's giving you, really, don't you?
Yes, you do. And one of the advantages, the longer term advantages of using Excel rather than a piece of proprietary software, is that most people tell me that after they've gone through what can be the pain barrier using Excel, learning how to grapple with all of that, as well as all the ups and downs of the, critical analysis that happens along the way, is that when they go back to using their software, they can kind of see further down the track for the client. So they can see, when there's a train wreck approaching them from a little bit further off, because they can actually start to use and apply that critical thinking that they've learned to do, with us during those 10 weeks of gaining their CFP license.
Exactly. And I think the thing to always bear in mind with this is that it is essentially a journey. And, so you start literally crawling, eventually you walk, and eventually you'll run. And, so I wouldn't worry about it. If you really aren't familiar with Excel or the other aspects, as you go along, you will learn them and you'll come out of it with, better skilled. And in some ways, even if you then go back to using the proprietary software, because you've constructed the whole thing from the ground up, you have a much better insight into the underlying issues than you did before, really. And that'll make you a better financial planner.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And and these case studies, they're 4 separate, distinct objectives, aren't they, that the clients want to achieve. So, in real life with real clients, you might only tackle 1 or 2 objectives, perhaps at any one point, or an annual review. But this is designed, it's kind of, I always term it like a 3D jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? That you've got these 4 distinct objectives and you've got to work out the best fit in order to meet all of those objectives. So you can't just spend all the money on school fees, say, and go, well, actually, you can't retire when you want to. You've got to actually find solutions and make firm recommendations for each of those 4 areas, haven't you?
Exactly. As with the rest of life, there are choices that you make, and all the choices have good things and bad things about them. And you have to, try to reconcile them so that they come together to make a coherent plan as best as you can.
Yeah. And one of the things when you're going through that process of building the spreadsheets and, applying your critical thinking brain to all of this, is that you can work out the trade-offs, talk about the strategies. We're not asking for a reasons why and a reasons why not letter or suitability and why not suitable, but we are, and the assessors are looking for a discussion of the various strategies, not pages and pages of discussion, but, what's the most simple solution in any particular given scenario that works for the client? Are there, quite often you'll find, I'm sure that, you all find in real life that, like you say, when you make that decision, there might be 1 or 2 solutions that potentially could fit the bill, aren't there? So, and then you kind of have to think through, well, actually, is one more simple than the other? Is one cheaper than the other? Actually, the cheapest one might not work for a whole host of different reasons. And then you're exploring those strategies. And that's what using Excel and forcing your critical brain to start firing into life, that's all that starts to happen, isn't it?
Exactly. That's it. That's exactly correct. So it's all about really, getting to grips with the numbers, unfortunately, first, and then, seeing what they tell you and trying out different options till you arrive at one that works as best as possible. It is the challenge of the CFP is this business that Jackie's been mentioning, which is that it's not just a single track. You're not just writing a report to recommend someone buys a Pru bond. You're actually trying to deal with 4 different conflicting calls on somebody's money and trying to work out how best to reconcile them so that you can achieve all 4. And it's not necessarily easy to do that.
No. So the easiest place is at the start. So where do we start? Well, we start with what's the client got now, don't we?
Yes.
We don't. One of the things that I say time and time again, probably a dozen or more times on every course that we run, is do not jump the hurdles quickly and get into solution mode. You've got to be, like we've said on our first podcast in the series, you've got to take it step by step and one bite at a time. And you've got to start with a client's current situation to analyze, to establish, to look at the tax aspects of their current situation. We're not saying, oh, he needs a pension. Oh, they need to increase their pension. Oh, they've paid too much tax. Oh, whatever it might be. Those are thoughts. We're not making recommendations. These are what's the client got now? Can they achieve their objectives with what they've got now? Are the assets that they have, are they aligned with their attitude to risk and their capacity for loss? Something like capacity for loss actually is one of the things that a lot of people do tend to miss out on when they're completing their financial plan, aren't they?
Well, I think one of the problems is that a lot of people muddle capacity for loss with risk profile, don't they?
Yeah.
The risk profile is how you feel about investment risks, and capacity for loss is how much can your investments go down by before your ability to meet your goals is prejudiced. And,
yes.
the first one is a matter of subjective opinion, and the second one is actually not a matter of subjective opinion. It's a matter of fact insofar as far as it goes. You need to run the numbers and actually check that to get the answer. The clients won't know. They'll have a view on what it is, but they won't actually know.
No. And I think it's very interesting how the FCA across the years has talked about, capacity for loss, attitude to risk, and also need or tolerance, isn't it? That how much can I, invest or afford to lose before, my financial life falls apart and it is, devastated from here on in.
That's absolutely correct. So when you're looking at the achievement of your financial goals, when you run the initial set of numbers, you're going to make some observations about them, aren't you? The critical one being, can you achieve the goals that you've outlined you want to achieve or not? And if you can't achieve them, then there's a number of remedies available to you, aren't there? Including pushing back the date when you want, whatever your retirement to happen, changing the number you want out. And another one of the options, obviously, is to potentially increase the risk profile of your investments so as to improve the potential that you will actually achieve your goal. But that comes with short-term risks. So all these things have to be weighed up. And actually, there's a third variant, which is you may be absolutely, totally able to achieve your lifetime financial goals, so much so that your money is going to grow hugely. And by the time you go to meet your maker, HMRC will be able to clear the national debt with the amount of inheritance tax they collected off your estate. So that may be an observation that you might make, in which case, what does that mean for investments? It means you don't need to keep on plowing on with, 100% equity portfolio. You don't actually have to take that much risk anymore. You only actually need to take the amount of risk you need to take to achieve your goals, not more than it. You may choose to take more than it, but you don't have to do that. And that's one of the considerations that would come out when constructing a financial plan, really.
Yes. And also when everybody gets their case study, they'll get a fact find, they'll get some interview notes, and they also get some expenditure details, quite detailed and comprehensive expenditure information, don't they? And obviously that is another potential source of, action or recommendations to make changes, maybe to some of the more obviously, high spending areas. Maybe they're spending, I don't know, £10,000 a year on a wine bill or something like that. And, it's something that you could look at during the assessment. You have to be really careful. You can't just say, well, you can't achieve all your goals, therefore I'm going to slash your income by 50% for just because I can, because I can make this all the spreadsheets work if I slash it by 50%. That is not financial planning, is it? That's not how it works.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So you clearly do need to think about how the expenditure may be adjusted as you go through your life. And there are some obvious ones. I mean, clearly, if your mortgage is due to be paid off by a given age, then you know that you can knock that off, assuming they keep up the repayments. If you know they're making educational payments now for a specified amount of time for whatever the kids until they grow up, until they finish university, again, those things can stop. And other things may well change, that they might not necessarily go down. I mean, your wine bill might go up or down. I mean, if your wine bill is big enough, it might impact on your life expectancy. So not that you can really estimate that very accurately, but you do need to think through all these things. And one of the things we're probably going to get onto assumptions at some point.
I was just going to mention them.
Assumptions are a critically important thing, but they need to be reasoned and reasonable, and Jackie's going to come onto it in a minute. But you can go crazy with them and produce and have so many on the go that if you actually apply them, you're going to get in a complete tangle. At the end of the day, what you're trying to produce is something that's going to make sense to a recipient, isn't it? So it's not an end in itself, if that makes sense.
No. And we know the one thing about assumptions is that they are definitely going to be wrong tomorrow. Whichever way we shake it or make it, we know that they are going to be wrong tomorrow. And people always pull a face at me when I say this, but I always think of assumptions as kind of our educated best guess at what the future holds. And they are no more than the educated best guess. So when you're running your spreadsheets, you don't have to do them to 2 decimal places, because your educated best guess is not down to the penny. It doesn't need to be, can round it to the nearest pound or anything like that, or, maybe in the nearest 50. You've got to be broadly accurate, but, there is spurious precision, and we can, get hung up on like we were saying earlier, the lack of thinking critically and just looking at the numbers. But actually what we want to understand is, as with many clients, when you see a real client, am I going to be okay? Are these clients going to be okay? If their assets are exactly as they are now, as they came in through the door to see you, as per the fact find and interview notes, are they going to be okay? Answer: probably not. And that's then starts this whole raft of different options available to you. But if we think and just pause on assumptions at the moment, I know everybody probably knows me well enough by now to know that assumptions are my favorite subject. There are already 2 podcasts out there that my husband Rob and I, who've had discussions. He is basically the king of assumptions. I think we are all in agreement. And we've had a number of discussions that are available for you to listen to on the podcast about the ins and outs of assumptions and how to set them. But briefly, the easiest way to think about an assumption is to go through those 3 steps. And that is to say, well, what's happened historically for any given assumption I'm looking at? What's the historic trend? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it flat? Why? Get a source. Then the second step is to say, well, what's the current situation? So if you're looking at longevity, you might say, okay, well, for this particular client, well, historically, longevity has been increasing. We're all living longer, advances in medical science, or beta blockers and all the rest of it after the year 2000 when they all came in. And I have a client who has had a heart attack and who is in ill health now. So how does that impact their longevity, the assumption I'm going to make? So we've got a historic bit, and then we say, well, this particular client has a health issue. Is that health issue potentially going to limit their life expectancy? You make a decision on that, yes or no. And then you say, actually, my financial plan, as all financial plans are, they are a forward-looking process, aren't they? So we are planning for the clients in your case study, you're planning for 30 or 40 years into the future. So that third step is, do you think that either the past or the current is reflective of the future or not? And if not, then that is your opportunity to explain why. And then the number is what the number is then.
Exactly. And when you do this, you do need to evidence it. So it's not enough to sort of say what Chris Wicks thinks or Jackie thinks. You really need to sort of look at the data and think about it, and then give a reasoned explanation for why you're doing it based on your best interpretation and evidence that you've managed to find to support your argument, really.
Yeah.
By the way, it doesn't really matter what you actually say unless it's absolutely ridiculous. It just needs to be properly and sensibly explained.
Yes.
And that's what we need to do, okay? Because there isn't a right or wrong answer. Two different people can have different answers. It's fine.
Yeah. And we quite often say, if you and I had the same case study to work on, if we were doing our CFP assessment ourselves all over again, that actually there isn't a perfect DS solution, is there? There isn't a perfect set of assumptions. There are many right answers. There are some wrong answers, like you say, if you said that, you're given some assumptions by the CISI for price inflation, for earnings inflation, and for some of the basic asset classes. So if you made an assumption for something completely different that is related to the information that you've been given, then you need to bear that information in mind, don't you? So, for example, if you were looking at, I don't know, you've been given gilt information with your case study by the CISI, and you're looking at annuity rates. And we all know that long-term annuity rates have an impact on annuity assumptions and annuity rates. And therefore, if you've been given some information about gilts, does the information that you've already been given, does that have any bearing on this issue of gilts that we're looking at with the long-term gilt rate? And the answer might be no, because it's maybe a basket of current gilts, for example. It might be yes. And so if you have information that you've already been given, then your assumption needs to be kind of sit nicely in line with all the assumptions that you've been given so far as well. So you can't have a set that are nice and neatly aligned to each other if you think in terms of inflation plus something when you're looking at setting an assumption. So if you set inflation, I've seen some people who looked up clients' individual expenditure inflation. And there are a number of different websites that you can look up. You can plug in all their expenditure information. It tells you what their expenditure escalation inflation rate is. And you think, well, that's great. But in the small print at the bottom, it automatically applies. The rate it gives you is in nominal terms, including inflation. And the rate that it applies of inflation that's applied to that number is in the small print at the bottom. And the last time I ran a course, we were looking at this, and somebody said, well, my client's individual expenditure escalation rate was about 11%. And I was like, wow, that's huge. And I was like, your figures are going to be, way off the charts, but if you stick with that. So I said, just, do a screen grab, and let's have a look and see. And when we looked at the bottom, it said in the small print that the assumed rate of inflation was 8.5%. Now, the rate of inflation that you have been given by the CISI, last time I checked, was 2%. So obviously you're not comparing like with like, are you? If you're going to get assumptions from places like that, you need to make sure that you're taking into account the assumptions that you've been given by the CISI.
I think that's right. And look, the job is hard enough. The CISI has given you some assumptions. Use them for the purpose of the plan. You don't need to go and construct those. You've got plenty of other assumptions you do need to think about and research, but the CISI's ones, you don't need to do anything with them other than just use them. And you also don't need to give a reason why you're using them and so on. You can just use them. Whereas all the other assumptions that you use in the plan, you do need to actually provide a reasoning for why you're using them. And that reasoning needs to be reasonable. In fact, the whole plan needs to be reasonable. It just isn't an end in itself. It's not some little academic project that's going to, it's actually meant to be a real thing that you'd be doing for a client, really.
Yeah. And, you can go to town writing up your assumptions, can't you, with all sorts of data and explanations. And, because we can't interact with the client, we tend to, verbalize more, write more into the financial plan when we're writing up our assumptions, particularly if it's an area that you haven't looked at before. So what I normally say is to everybody, my final tip of today's podcast, I think, would be do not write more than 5 pages of reasons on your assumptions, purely because when you add in the probably 20 pages of Excel spreadsheets that you're going to import in when you've finished all your calculations and recommendations, then you've only got 35 pages to write up and say everything that you need to say. And that was 35 pages might sound like a lot. It's actually not a lot when you consider that you're covering those 4 technical areas.
Exactly. So it's like any extended piece of work. When you're looking at it before you started, it seems enormous. And you're thinking 60 pages, that won't be a problem. I'll be lucky if I get 20 pages done. Don't worry, you probably end up doing way, way more than what you should do, and you'll be culling it back, So try to adopt a disciplined, structured approach.
Yeah.
Putting the thing together in the first place to limit the extent to which you need to then go back and edit it away.
Yes. And in our next episode, we are going to talk about that very subject, about how to write it up, making recommendations, and everything that's involved in building and submitting that plan for the assessment. Chris, thanks very much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
It's really interesting, isn't it, to listen to different people who have different experiences of gaining their Certified Financial Planner certification, or maybe developing the financial planning profession at large. If you know anybody who you think might be interested in listening to any of these podcasts, then please do pass on our details. That's it for me. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. See you again soon. Bye for now.